The Galactic Union saw the human ships begin to move towards the edge of the dead zone. They had 3.5 minutes before the human ships breached the edge of the dead zone and their weapons could lock onto their position. They knew exactly where the humans were going to come out, and they figured that as soon as they crossed the dead zone, they could open up with their main cannons and take out that massive ship at the center of the battle group. What they didn't know is the humans had a little bit of a surprise for them. Less than 30 seconds behind that first battle group, the rest of the battle groups came in at light speed and then went full burn at sublight speed to try and catch up with the first battle group. However, they had to get into combat speed as fast as they could, or else they would be cut apart piecemeal. As the human forces breached the line, that is when the Galactic Union ships charged up their weapons and began to fire into the human ships. Without hesitation, the human ship turrets raised, aimed, and fired their ordnance as fast as they could, and the sky began to burn with the amount of energy weapons flying in and the amount of projectiles flying out. Every torpedo tube, every missile tube, every gun was firing. The Galactic Union believed that they had the advantage and believed that this would be a quick fight. However, as they began to see damage on the first main ship and several of their support ships had already begun venting atmosphere and tried to break away, to their absolute horror, over 10 more of these main battleships made their way in. It was a complete shock. However, it did not stop the Galactic Union from firing. If anything, they began to run their weapons hot in a desperate attempt to try and knock the enemy forces back. Retreating slightly as they fired, they realized that the human ships were getting close. So close, in fact, by galactic terms, it can be considered a knife fight. As each of the ship began to breach the dead zone, more and more ordnance began to fly out towards the Galactic Union ships. The Galactic Union ships began to traverse themselves sideways to get more guns to bear as their main bow-mounted batteries began to overheat. Going for a full broadside, they tried to fire at the human ships as the human ships continued to advance as fast as they could, trying to breach the line of the Galactic Union ships. As though a bubble was expanding, the Galactic Union ships spread out further and further to make sure the human ships did not get in their lines. They feared, if nothing else, if the main cannons were as strong as what they saw, a full broadside from human ships would be beyond devastating. However, they were not expecting the humans to have any more of those energy weapons. As the rest of the large Dreadnoughts came into play, they began to charge up their main guns. This huge particle laser was designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to split planets. However, it will do very well against Galactic Union ships. With each one as they came out spread hundreds of thousands of kilometers wide from each other in almost a spiderweb formation. They came in at odd angles. It wasn't long before the Galactic Union ships realized what was happening as they could sense the large charge of energy through their sensors, and before they could move, huge swaths of blue lasers began to whip across the entire battle zone, ripping apart any ship in its wake. The humans were not unscathed in this, as they ended up ending their laser fire and continued on with projectile cannons. Many of their small ships were damaged in trying to retreat, venting atmosphere. Some had been shredded, others melted, as you could see the humans vented into the atmosphere. However, the Galactic Union ships weren't doing any better themselves. Even though the humans were at this point outnumbered, probably 200 to 1, it did not matter. They were going to give them a good old human fuck you as they ordered all their ships into full speed ahead, and each one burst into the enemy lines. The point defense cannons were now in play, running hot as they blew hundreds of trillions of rounds of tungsten metal into the enemy ships. Though they would bounce off the energy shields only slightly, after 4 or 5 rounds they would begin to go through. The energy shields were not designed for projectiles, they were designed for energy weapons. And that's all. Outside the dead zone, there's almost no space debris. The void is quite literally that, the void. There's nothing out there. So they didn't have to worry about large hulls. They didn't have to worry about thermal bursts that would melt through their hulls. They didn't have to worry about the absolute horror show that is space inside the dead zone. So their ships began to get ripped apart like paper. The battle, even only lasting about 5 minutes, the humans began to rip into the formation deep enough that many ships began to turn and run. To their absolute horror, some of the main dreadnought ships of the Galactic Union actually fired on those attempting to flee. However, with their main guns pointed at the human fleet, most of the shots went wild, or were just not powerful enough to damage the ships as they were out of range. With the enemy lines beginning to break, the destroyers ran towards the line. They charged the guns with reckless abandonment. The turrets began to traverse up, down, left, right, even though there is no up or down in space. The pitch and yaw of the ships as they dodged fire were absolutely sporadic. Anything smaller than a destroyer began to go through the enemy fleet, going around them like you would see a motorcycle go around cars, but in this case, it was three-dimensional fighting. Drifting while firing was commonplace. They would even wait until they were at quite literal point-blank range for the enemy ships before they fired their dorsal-mounted railguns, as Q ships even joined the fight as they fired at what they could into the enemy fleet. The comm system was absolutely flooded with all sorts of reports of ships being hit, ships being disabled, and even enemy ships begging the humans for mercy. This call did not fall on deaf ears as a message went out in Galactic Standard. This is Admiral Pop of the human fleet. If you are willing to stand down, we will spare your lives. Power down your weapons and your engines, and we will consider you non-hostile, and you will survive. I say again, power down weapons and engines, and we will consider you non-hostile. Failure to do so, and you will be destroyed today. It did not take more than a few seconds before some ships began to stop firing and shut their weapons off and let themselves go adrift. To some of the Galactic Union, this was akin to being a traitor, and they were fired upon by their own ships. These zealots were immediately targeted, as every ship captain gave the order for their gunners to target any of the enemy ships that fire on their own. This day, humans will get more than their pound of flesh. They will get their bellies full for centuries to come. But as it is said before, there's no reason we can't be civil about this, is there? It was another 30 minutes of energy blasts going through armor, projectiles piercing and splitting ships, torpedoes ripping into a hull and blasting huge holes in them, and missiles moving this way and that as they went onto smaller targets. Even the carrier finally arrived and the drones were released. These drones went into the enemy fleet and strafed everything that was there. Anything that was not marked as surrendered, it went in and began tear asunder. This was one of the few areas that they realized that the Galactic Union had actually prepared for, as they did have point defense systems that tore the drones up fairly well. Even with the drones being torn up, that was more than enough to shut down the last of the enemy shields, and the largest enemy ship would go silent. Humans at that time broadcast again. This is Admiral Pop of the human fleet. Stand down. I say again, stand down. The battle is lost and there is no reason for you to surrender your lives this day. It did not take long before the Galactic Union fleet, what was left of it, left in tatters, was sending out message begging for help as their ships were venting atmosphere, venting radiation into their crew compartments. Anything would help them. They would give anything, even if it meant becoming slaves as they knew it. Since that is the way the Galactic Council does things, they simply assumed that is the way humans would take care of things. They were wrong. For many of these Xenos from the Galactic Union, the first thing they saw of a human was these massive mechanical forms, and they would scream out, "Oh, robot, 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 android," or something along those lines in their own verbiage. It wasn't long before they realized this giant bipedal creature was actually trying to give them aid. It didn't matter if it was putting some sort of helmet on them so they could breathe, treating their wounds, carrying those that were unable to stand to another ship to be treated. Every single one of these battlefield angels, even though they had lost their brethren in the first battle, were still willing to go onto ships that may or may not be stable, that may or may not explode at any time as their reactors were beginning to fail. They still would go in and save the creatures of the Galactic Union, those that were willing to surrender. Though there was at least 2 ships, and thankfully only 2, that feigned surrender. And as the recovery ship came close, one of which that docked into its hull, the ship exploded. I guess they're a little bit more human than we thought, as that was a Xeno version of fuck you. The rest of them, however, decided that death was not the answer this day. They ended up being surprised that they were treated humanely. This was a word they didn't understand, but they would learn very quickly as the fleet began to capture tens upon thousands of Xenos. More than 3 dozen different species, many of which were so small they barely counted as actual species, only the size of maybe a cellular phone, and yet they were able to carry speech, and they were able to pilot their ships. Others long and gangly, almost tentacle-like or squid-like as their movements. Each one just happy to still be breathing. Each one expecting to be put in bondage as soon as their wounds healed. Each one expecting to be sold to the highest bidder. And each one surprised when they were told, "That's not how we do things." But each one was still surprised when they found out that they were not leaving the human fleet. They were with the human fleet all the way to the home of the Galactic Council. It would be approximately 6 days before the fleet was underway, as they had to send their own damaged ships back into the dead zone to be repaired. This still left over 10 different battle groups, along with their associated dreadnoughts, ready to fly to the center of the Galactic Union. This time, the message they're going to send isn't going to be human slang or ambiguous in any way. They're going to make sure the message is nice and clear.